What is going on, everybody? Today I'm going to show you guys how to do brakes on an '07 Toyota Camry with a 2.4 liter engine in it. Very simple to do. Be doing the rear brakes. The same exact concept can be applied to any brakes that you do. The same idea applies to any brake system. Obviously there's a little bit of differences depending on the tools that you use, but for the most part everything's the same. Let's go ahead and get started. So on the rear brakes of this car, there's not going to be too many tools that are going to be specialized. Everything's going to be linked in the description below so you know exactly what tool list that you need. But this is going to pretty much cover anything. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing I'm going to do is go ahead and remove the two caliper bolts that hold the caliper to the caliper bracket. These look like they're going to be a 14 millimeter bolt socket that you're going to need. I'm going to use a short snap-on 3/8 socket on it and a 3/8 ratchet to break it loose first. The reason why I like to break these bolts loose first is because a lot of times I can't get my gun in there, or I can't get an air ratchet in there, so I like to just break them loose first because it's very important that you don't strip bolts out, and you want to make sure that the bolt is completely hugged by the socket. And if it's a little bit off and you're hitting it with the impact gun or impact wrench, then you're gonna have a strip bolt, and you don't want that. So I always recommend breaking bolts loose, especially if you can't get a good grip on it with your gun, because at the end of the day, it's better to break it loose first and then finish it off with your electric gun or your impact gun than it is to try to do it with your impact gun and then strip the bolt. So always try to break it loose first by hand, then use a power tool. Now that I have it loose, I'm going to go ahead and use my electric gun with the swivel 14 millimeter just to get in there, finish off the bolt so I don't have to spend all day removing these bolts. And that's what I mean. It doesn't matter if it's a little bit off the bolt because it's already broken loose. You're not going to strip it because the tension is completely off the bolts already. So put these away, put these on the side. Obviously don't lose them. You want to make sure that they're nice and safe. And this piston, we're going to go ahead and compress it. There's a couple ways you can do this, and I actually asked a lot of my mechanics that I help through my YouTube if they remove the bleeder, if they loosen up the bleeder to push in the piston, and a lot of guys say they don't. A lot of guys said they did. So at the end of the day, there's 50-50. I bet it's pretty much all preference, and there is definitely good reasons to open it, but in most cases, it's not going to damage the car if you don't open the bleeder screw. I've never had to open up the bleeder screw when I press in the piston. I've never had any problems, but obviously there is good reason to do it. You don't want to have any dirty brake fluid go back inside the system, but at the end of the day, it's not going to affect anything if you don't open it. So there's no negatives. There's more positives to opening it, but also there's a lot more work when it comes to that. So if you're a beginner mechanic or if you're just getting things done quickly, don't worry about opening up the bleeder screw because it's not going to affect anything too bad. Obviously there's always a risk of having some damage happen, but you have to mitigate that risk with your own experience. And in my experience, I've never had a problem pushing piston in without opening up the bleeder screw, so I think it'll be fine this time. But one of the ways that you like to push in the piston is you can use a screwdriver, and what you do is you loosen up the caliper like this, and then you put the flathead up against the piston and up against the brake pad, and you just go ahead and press in the piston like so. Okay, and you push the piston in, and you just push it all the way in until it's compressed, and then you can remove the caliper and the piston will be compressed. So that's one way to do it. I like to do it this way just because it's a little bit faster for me, and but sometimes I can't get a flathead inside the caliper because sometimes there's no little hole here. So sometimes you can't get anything in there, so you're gonna have to use another tool. Now, there's a lot of guys that use a whole bunch of different things. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what tool you use as long as the job gets done and it gets done properly. So I'm not a big proponent on being specific with, oh, you got to use this tool for this job. To me, as long as you get the thing done, that's all that matters. So the way that but one of the things that you have to remember is you want to be as efficient as possible. So I use this caliper compressor tool, link in the description below, and all the tools that I use in this video are going to be linked in the description, so you guys go pick those up, and it helps support the channel if you use the Amazon links, because I get a little commission. So thank you so much for the support. So please buy your tools through the links in the description, because it helps your boy out. But anyways, the caliper compressor tool is a very nice tool. It's fast. It makes you, a lot more efficient, because it just press it in and you're good to go. There's a whole bunch of different designs in these. There's some that are air powered. I like this one just because it's, quick and easy. I just put it in and good to go. So the way this works is I like to use an old pad. Put the pad up against the piston, then go ahead and put the caliper tool in between the caliper edge of it and then the brand new, the old brake pad, I mean, and you go ahead and compress it, and then it'll compress, just like so. Make sure it's all the way in, and you pop it off using this little lever on the back of it here, and then you're good to go. Obviously, you want to make sure that the boot is nice and safe. There's no issues with it. You want to make sure that there's no other problems going on in here, because the boot, if the boot is broken, a bunch of dirt and debris will get inside the piston bore, and then the seal that keeps everything and keeps all the fluid inside will break. So you want to be really careful with that, and if there is any damage to it, you want to go ahead and replace the caliper, because you're going to have problems down the line. So we're going to go ahead and remove the caliper bracket now from the back. The two bolts back here, I think they are also a 14 millimeter. Yep, 14 millimeter on the caliper brackets. We're going to go ahead and remove those, break them loose first with our 3/8 ratchet, and then I'll be able to use my gun on it. And then we're going to go ahead and replace the rotor as well, because the rotors are too thin for us to resurface, so we're going to go ahead and replace them. So I'll show you guys how to measure these out. I'll show you guys how to do a full brake job and how to check everything. But for the most part, you want to take, I'll show you guys right now. So you take your calipers, and these are actually not for brakes. Normally the ones that are for brakes have a little the jaws are a little bit different, so that they can get up against the rotor, because a lot of times these rotors will have lips, and if you measure them out, you're going to be measuring the lip and not the actual thickness of the rotor. But I'm just going to give you guys an example how to measure them out. So the way you do it is that you take your caliper, you go up against the rotor, and then you get your measurement, and then a lot of times the actual measurement, the minimum thickness, will be on the rotor, and this one actually does have it, so I'll show you guys that. And then what you do is you measure out the rotors, and then you compare it to the minimum thickness that these rotors can be. So we have here the minimum thickness is 8.5 millimeters. So we're gonna go ahead and measure these out, and then we're gonna see if they're too thin. So once you get your measurement from the rotor, you can look at the actual rotor and then look at the stamp and see if they're too thin. If they're too thin, then don't go ahead and resurface them. Normally what I like to see though is if it's 8.5 millimeter, I will want to see an extra, like I want to see 9 millimeter. That would be my minimum, because you got to remember, if the rotor is right now at 8.5 before you resurface it, when you resurface it, it's going to go below 8.5, which is the minimum thickness. So you got to keep that in mind. So you got to make sure that you know how much you're going to be taking off. And normally you take off about 20th, one quarter, like a quarter of material off. So you're gonna be below that thickness. So you gotta make sure that even if it is at 8.5 and you measure out like 8.6, you gotta know that, hey, I'm gonna take off a lot off this rotor to make it nice and smooth and flat again. So I'm gonna be below the thickness, so I better recommend them now. So normally if it's at like 8.5, I like to see 9 when I measure them out, so I know that there's enough material for me to resurface, to take off and resurface the rotor properly. So keep that in mind when you're measuring out rotors. Now to remove the rear bolts. Sometimes to get like a little bit of leverage, you gotta go like underneath the car. Get that one off. That one off. Not that they're loose. I like to just use my electric gun and remove them. And like I said, ladies and gentlemen, if you do want to use your impact gun on these things, be really careful, because you're going to have to use a swivel, and sometimes swivels don't hug the bolt very well. so you'll strip them. So be really careful. So if in doubt, if you're just a little bit in doubt that it'll strip, just go ahead and break them loose by hand first, and then go ahead and use your gun, because it's gonna, you could run into some issues. And it's better just to mitigate that by not even going that route, by doing what you need to do by hand first. But anyways, this is a caliper bracket. We're gonna go ahead and check out the clips. A lot of times when they are original clips like these are, I like to reuse them because these clips normally are a little bit tighter than the aftermarket ones. So these though, they look like they've been used before, or a lot. So they are a little bit loose, so I might just go ahead and replace them. Normally the original ones are always nice and tight, and they don't move. And I don't like using the new ones because those, sometimes they're not up to spec, and what will happen is that the clips will break, and then the clip will move in and out, and it'll cause a squeak, and then you're screwed and the customer comes back. So be really careful when you replace these. Replace them if you can. Obviously, if you're in the East Coast, you're gonna have to replace them no matter what because they get so rusted. But here in California, just look at them and make sure that they're okay. These I'm probably gonna replace just because they're not nice and tight anymore. So I'm gonna go ahead and replace them. And then the last thing you gotta remember is to go ahead and grease these pins. These pins are what actually make the caliper move in and out. So they are greased, and they do have a boot here. So you gotta make sure that the boot is nice and safe and not broken, and then that the grease in there isn't all gunked up and causing the caliper to seize up, because that grease, I'll show you guys right now, it'll turn into glue, and it'll like keep the caliper from moving in and out. So take these bad boys out, clean this off, put new grease in there, and then pop it back in, and you should be good to go. And then the last thing is that a lot of guys were asking me, should you put grease on where the clips, on where the brake pad rides on? And I always say no, because a lot of times the brake dust will build up on that grease, and it'll cause it to gunk up, and it'll make it into glue, pretty much cement, and then it'll keep the pad from moving in and out, causing uneven wear. So don't put any grease on the caliper clips, because on the brake pad clips, because you will have issues. Don't do it. I don't care what anybody says. I've had too many problems doing that. When I was at school, a lot of guys would always say, "Oh yeah, you're supposed to put grease on everything that the brake pad contacts on, even on the back of the brake pad, like right here, because there's like a noise and stuff like that." I'm like, okay, and I put freaking grease everywhere, and then everything would seize up, and then I would be screwed 3 months later when the customer came back. So don't do it. I've never had any issues. Use a good brake pad, and as long as you do the proper procedures and grease everything where you're supposed to, you should be fine. So don't put any grease here. If you want to argue me in the comment section. I'll tell you how wrong you are for doing it like that, because you're going to have issues. I've done these hundreds of times. I've never had any problems not putting grease there. Okay? So now we're going to go ahead and remove the rotor and put the new one on. On the East Coast, you guys are gonna have to like hit the freaking rotor like crazy. Here in California, you gotta just tap it, and it pops off, just like that. Obviously, sometimes you're gonna have to hit it a little bit harder. If you do have to hit it harder, then go ahead and put a little bit of degreaser and stuff like that, or not degreaser, penetrating spray, so you can loosen up some of that rust. See, talking all this smack about how the West Coast is, the rotors come off, then it won't come off. There you go. Okay, so the e-brake is behind the rotor, and these actually look fine, but if you do need to replace them, make sure you replace them. For the most part though, e-brakes don't go out too often. So just keep that in mind. I normally check them, but sometimes you don't have to, because they're always in good shape. When you put the new rotor on, you're gonna have to put a little bit of grease here, especially if you're in the East Coast. East Coast guys, you guys like put anti-seize up against the hub just because you have to, because of the rust. Here in California, it's normally not really a big deal. I like to put it just a little bit around here, just so when the new rotor needs to come off again, it's going to be easier for me to do it, because the customers that I have, they always come back, so I know that the car needs to be maintained, so it makes my job easier down the line. So I put a little bit of oil here, or anti-seize here up against the hub, and then that's pretty much it, and then I put the new rotor on. So let's go ahead and get the new rotor and throw it on. NICs here. Like I said, put a little bit on the hub. Okay, on the brake rotors, you always want to clean them off, because when they make these at the factory, they throw a little bit of coat of oil on them so they don't rust while they're in storage or while they're being sold. So you gotta remember to clean that little coat of oil off, or else they're gonna contaminate the brand new brake pads, causing a whole bunch of issues. So the way you do that is you can use degreaser or just dishwashing soap if you have some at home, and just kind of like wash them off with, you know, dishwashing soap and water or degreaser. But I like to use brake cleaner just because it's a lot more pungent, not pungent, more effective. So just spray it all down, and you just wipe it down, and you're good to go. You gotta make sure you do both sides. Just a little quick tip: when you remove the clips, make sure that you remove them, and then you remove them, and then you go and look at the new clips, because some of these are different. Okay, so some of them are the same, some of them are different depending on what side they're on, or if they're the top or the bottom. So just keep that in mind when you're removing them, to always match it up and make sure that you got the exact same one going back in, because the last thing you want is for you to do this entire job, then put it back on the floor and then take it for a test drive, and then you have a little bit of grinding noise because you put the clips in improperly. So always make sure that you put the correct clips back when you put it in, just by matching them up with the original ones, and you should be good to go. Because remember, like some of these sizes, like the size of the face of it will be different depending on which one it goes to, and then if you put it like on this side, the big side will be on this side, you know. So just keep in mind that, you know, you got to match it up before you put it in. This bad boy is nice and tight on there. It's good to go. Go ahead and place the other one. On this one, actually, there's no differences, so you could just throw them on. But just in case, so you are doing another brake job, just keep that in mind, because the last thing you want is to waste time. Wasting time is the biggest problem when it comes to making money in the automotive industry. So make sure that you guys are always being as efficient as possible by not messing anything up. Okay, so put it back in. A lot of guys like to put a little bit of blue silicone on these, or blue Loctite, just so they make sure that they don't come out. On these ones, the original ones didn't come with Loctite. They're just a regular bolt, and they have a lock washer on top of them. So I'm not too worried about putting it back in. The one thing I would say though is to always make sure that they're nice and tight, they're nice and torqued down. If you don't have a torque wrench, just make sure that you use your ratchet and they're tight. The last thing you want is for a bolt to come off and then you have issues with your brakes. That's the worst, but just make sure that everything's nice and tight and you shouldn't have a problem. Okay, so now that we have the caliper bracket back on, we're gonna go ahead and throw on the brake pads. Now, some of these are, on Toyotas especially, they come with like a little clip. So these little clips will go on the side of the brake pad, and what they do is it acts like a little sensor. Okay, so there is some assembly required sometimes depending on the car you're working on. So on this one, the old ones didn't have this clip. The old brake pads didn't have this clip that attaches to them. I suspect because somebody didn't put it on, because these brake pads aren't the original ones. So I'm gonna go ahead and throw on this little sensor and then throw it on. I always like to put the sensor on the inside where the piston goes, because those brake pads normally wear out faster than the outside brake pad. So just so you know, that's my preference, and that's normally how I see them coming on vehicles that do have the sensor, is they always are on the side where the piston is. So throw those on. Pretty simple. You have to move the little clip a little bit sometimes. Isn't a big deal. Okay, there you go. And then what I like to do is take out the little sliders, little guides here, clean them off, nice and clean, and then I re-grease them. You can pick up some grease, some brake caliper grease at any auto parts store that you have around you, and you just throw a little bit on the guide. You don't want to cover this thing up in like a bunch of grease. because what ends up happening is when you put it back into the boot, that boot is pretty tight and it'll just like scrape all the grease off and you'll have a mess. So just enough to coat it, make sure everything's covered, okay? And you just want like a nice new layer of grease on there, because the caliper bracket does have some grease inside of it already, but you want to just keep it as fresh as possible every time you do a brake job, and try to like get new grease in there just so it doesn't gunk up, you know what I'm saying? So it's all in. Sometimes a little air gets stuck in the little boot, which is good because you know that it's nice and tight, but just let that air out by squeezing the boot. You let that air out, then you do the other one, and once we do the other one, we can put the caliper back on. When you put the caliper back on, sometimes you're gonna have to push in the little sliding pins, push them in so you can put in the caliper. Put it in, go ahead and put the bolts back in it, and that's basically the job. You gotta just make sure these things are tight. Go ahead and tighten these down, and once they're tight, you're good to go. Before you go ahead and start the car and actually back out the car from your shop or from your driveway, make sure you hit the brake pedal a few times to make sure that the piston gets detracted and it pushes out, so that you do have rear brakes. Especially important when you're doing the front brakes, because if you go ahead and start the car up, put it in reverse or drive, you're not gonna have any brakes because the piston is not fully out and it's not contacting the rotor. So you're gonna go forward if you don't do that first. So make sure you hit the brake pedal before you actually put the car in drive. Make sure you have a nice hard pedal before you actually take it out and drive, and just keep, you know, safety procedures all in line. That's it. Very basic to do a brake job on any type of car. You can use these exact same procedures for any car you're working on, whether it's a BMW or an Audi, a Nissan, a Ford, whatever it is. The only difference is that some of the calipers are designed a little bit differently. So just know that, like, you know, European cars sometimes use electric e-brakes, so you have to use a scanner or have a different technique to press in the piston. For the most part though, the same idea applies to any car that you're working on. So just know that you pretty much get 95% of any car done using this procedure. If you guys have any questions on anything you're working on, leave it in the comment section below, because I love to help you guys. That's what I'm here for. This is why I made this video, so I can help you guys be more efficient, do the job properly, and get this money that you need to make so you can live a nice life. So make sure you guys hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and let me know what you liked about the video. All the tools that I use are linked in the description below. Thanks so much for watching. Take care. Let me see if I can go ahead, do it again. Just fuck around, move around.
It's go time! Yeah, guys, today I'm talking about this racket. Yeah, see this guy?
Think that again. Just fuck around, move around.
It's go time! Go time!